If you have a Bible and you like to follow along, please turn to Luke chapter 20. This is where we'll be spending our time. You know, at Advent, it always strikes me as we go through the weeks, and actually next year, I promise, I'm going to get a hold of the Anglican lectionary. And the reason for that is they work a 3-year cycle, but they have certain passages all through the month of Advent. Advent, there's a month. And there are certain sermon content commands, not suggestions. If you're an Anglican pastor, you have to do those sermons. So I would like to do that just as something to entertain the worldwide church calendar. So next year I'm going to do that. I've never done that before, but I thought it'd be a good thing for us. But one thing I think about at Advent every year, and it always strikes me, we see all the lights and we think about gift giving, we think about having family, we all enjoy, I do. I mean, I love strapping on my feed bag at Christmas and eating contraband in our house. I mean, it's just awesome. And I love having family over and all the laughter and everything that goes with it. But isn't it interesting to you, it is to me, that Jesus is the most thoroughly rejected person that has ever walked this earth? Can you think of anybody who has been more rejected than Jesus? And what did he do that ever caused him to be rejected like this, as he is? He didn't harm anybody. I mean, I guess the money changers, you know, the whip of cords, and it was probably kind of tough on those guys. But still, the people, the common people loved Jesus because of what he said and the way he taught. He came to bring something to human life in a universal way that all of us could enjoy and celebrate, and yet he's rejected, the most rejected person that has ever walked the earth. Let's take a look at the passage. I'll begin reading in Luke chapter 20, and I'll start reading in verse 9. Jesus began to tell the people a parable. He said, a landowner planted a vineyard and leased it to some tenant farmers, and then the landowner went away for a long time on a journey. When the harvest came, the landowner sent one of his servants to the tenants so that they would give the landowner his portion of the crop. However, the tenants beat the servant and sent the servant back to the landowner empty-handed. So the landowner sent another servant. They beat this one too, and treated him outrageously and sent him away empty-handed. So the landowner sent a third one, and they wounded this one and sent him and threw him out. The owner of the vineyard said to himself, "What will I do? I know what I'll do. I'll send my one dear son, and perhaps they'll respect him." But when the tenants saw the son, they said to one another, "This is the heir of the vineyard. Let's kill him, and then the inheritance will be ours." So they threw him out of the vineyard and killed him. What then will the owner of the vineyard do to these tenants? He'll destroy the tenants, and he'll give the vineyard to others. When the people heard this, they said, "May this never happen." Jesus is telling this story, and the people responded to him. But Jesus looked straight at them and said, "Then what is the meaning of that which is written? The stone builders rejected, the stone the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. Everyone who falls on this stone will be broken into pieces, but the one on whom it falls will be crushed." Then the experts in the law and the chief priests who were gathered there, who wanted to arrest him that very hour, knew that Jesus had told this parable against them, but they restrained themselves because they were afraid of the people. Okay. So here we are again with Jesus saying things that the people who know things about Judaism do not like to hear. He speaks a parable that deepens the hatred of those who already hate him. They've already rejected him as Messiah, and now they've come even further, and he uses a parable that everybody would have understood. If you were Jewish and you were standing in this crowd, when Jesus started talking about a vineyard, everybody knew what he meant. Everybody. Because Isaiah, in Isaiah chapter 5, speaks of the nation of Israel as a grapevine, God's vineyard. If you went to the temple, this imagery of the grapevine and the vineyard was so powerful for the Jew. It was so powerful that they spent, I don't know how much money, decorating the opening of the temple gate with, if you went from the the porch into the first court, which was the court of Israel, where women and men who were Jewish could go, there was 100-foot grapevine with hammered gold all over it. All the leaves and the stems were gold, and Jews would buy jewels, and they would adhere them to as grapes.
Gosh.
100 feet this thing was. How much did that cost? But that's how serious they were about this imagery of what it was that Israel was referred to as a grapevine. Well, the owner of the vineyard is obviously who in this parable? God. God owns the vineyard. And the tenants are who? Who are these tenants that are tending the vineyard? That when the owner of the vineyard goes away to a far country, who are the tenants? They're the Jewish officials. They're the people who are responsible to care for Judaism. They're the ones who are supposed to be the teachers, the ones who are supposed to be telling the common people what it is that God expects of them. Who are those servants who are sent to the tenants to extract what is due the owner of the vineyard? Those are the prophets that God sent throughout history to warn the nation. And then who's the son? That's Jesus himself. So you can see what's going on here. And is this not exactly how history has turned out? What happened when Jesus was rejected as Messiah? Paul went to the Gentiles. The Gentiles are now the church. The whole world is the church in that sense of whether they're Jew or Gentile converted, but the Jewish nation is no longer the oracle of God to the world. We are. So everything Jesus is talking about here, these Jewish officials, you can see how they would become quite angry with Jesus as he says this, because they know what he means. They know that he's talking directly about them. They're aware of the mechanics of this parable. Now the common people, maybe not. That's why they think of the fact that the son is killed and they say, may this never be. They're responding to it on a more human level. But the Jewish officials are responding to it because they know exactly what he means. Think about the picture of the tenants being left by the owner of the vineyard for a long time. That is exactly what's going on right at this moment. Right? God visited us. Jesus came. And he's been gone for a very long time. A very long time. Well, for the Jewish mindset, the presence of God was gone since the time of Ezekiel. For 600 years, the presence of God is gone from the temple. Wow. See, we look at the Bible. This is one of the places where the Bible becomes hard for us. When we look at it, we see all of this 1,500-year history compressed into a few pages. So you take a person like an Elijah who has a ministry that spans about 40 years, and it records 8 miracles. That's all. 8 miracles. And we read it in the little chapters that deal with Elijah, and we think, gosh, God's just doing miracles all over the place. The Bible's so different from us now. It's not. God is doing just as much today as he did then. Jesus the same yesterday, today, and forever. It's the perspective. Everybody in this room, me included, we all look at history as our lifespan. That's history for us. We don't think about 200 years ago. We might know of it, but we don't relate to it in that way. We relate to it in terms of the 50, 60, 70, or whatever years we've been around. That's history for us. And so when we see the miracles in the Bible, we think, gosh, things are so different. God just did miracles all over the place. No. Years went between these miracles. 40 years, 8 miracles, you do the math. And the killing of the prophets, these servants that were sent by the owner of the vineyard, God, they did that to them. Isaiah was sawn into pieces. Jeremiah was thrown into a hole. Look at the stuff that happened to Ezekiel. Look at the stuff that happened. Elijah was banished practically by Jezebel and Ahab. I mean, they had terrible lives as the servants. They were beaten and driven out. Just like he says, Zechariah was stoned to death at the altar. He'd come to the altar and he was stoned to death. John the Baptist had his head cut off. So what Jesus is talking about here, these guys, these Jewish guys, the officials, they know exactly what he means. This is no mystery to them. Why were the prophets treated that way? Why was Jeremiah thrown into a hole? He was thrown into a hole because he said to the king, these other prophets that are telling you that we're out of Babylon in 2 years, they're lying to you. God has told me we're going to be here for 70. You better go out and tell everybody to plant their gardens, raise their children, tend their crops, and pretend like we're going to be here for a long time and pray for the welfare of Babylon, because we are going to be here for 70 more years. But they didn't like that message, you see. So Jeremiah wound up in a hole. And then the killing of the son, this is where this history becomes so important. And if we're not aware of Jewish law, this part of the passage, yeah, we say, well, that makes sense. Jesus was put to death on the cross. That's right, but there's a reason that the tenants wanted to put him to death. The son who was sent, they said, we know what we'll do. We'll kill him, and then we'll inherit the field. You know why that is? Because in Jewish law, if you, let's say Marshall owned a field, and you and Becky decide we're going to go to Aruba for 3 years, and we're not going to worry about our field. And then KG comes along and says, well, they have this field and they've been gone for 3 years. And in Jewish law, if KG was tending that field for you and you didn't come back and you had no heirs, guess who inherits the field? KG. So if we kill, there you go. Well, there's something to dream about. But if we kill the only heir, the tenants say, well, then the field is ours. The vineyard's ours. What is that saying? These Jewish officials believed that the nation was theirs. It was their nation. You can understand now why they became so angry when Jesus said this to them. Well, I'm going to say this parable, if we think about it, it reveals a lot of stuff about humanity. First of all, that tenant relationship in the first century in Judea was common because Judea was poor. And so most of the people who had fields, they allowed tenants to come and tend them because that was the economic situation at the time. Wealth was concentrated. Most people were very poor, and so to be a tenant farmer was a good thing. It was well beyond just being absolutely impoverished where you own nothing at all. And look at what happened here with these tenants. The owner goes away. He doesn't stay there and supervise them. He doesn't stay there and demand things of them. He doesn't say, you've got to show me this much growth for this much input. I've got to have grapes, this many pounds of grapes every month or anything. He leaves them alone. That is exactly what God has done to us. And to the Jews at the time, he's left us alone. We're not supervised in that way. You and I can pretty much do whatever we want. And the Jewish officials at the time of Jesus saw life the same way. Where's God? I can't tell you how many people I correspond with on a weekly basis where that's the question. You keep talking about Jesus and you keep talking about the second coming, and you keep talking about judgment. We're here and 2,000 years have gone by. Where is he? He's not showed up. Why should we worry about that? So if they could kill the son, they removed the only heir, and now the field is theirs. Well, we've killed the son. He's gone. Martin Luther said if he were the owner of the field, this is his reaction to this very parable. He said, if I were the owner of the field, I would have kicked this place to pieces. Speaking of the whole earth. But God has been so patient, right? He's been so patient with us. All of the things that humanity, he's patient with me. He's patient with all of us. He's extra special patient with the whole of the earth. because there are people wherein Jesus is still the most rejected person on the planet, even today. Nothing has changed. Lots of people get sent. How many times in my life did I sit in First Baptist Church of Waycross? I hated to be there. Hated it. Raised in a family where the parents hated to be there. And I sat through sermon after sermon and Sunday school after Sunday school, and I heard the gospel, and I just said, that is not for me. I don't want that. This parable, I've been left, until I became a believer at 22 years old, I was 22 years left to myself. God didn't come in and sweep away all my objections, and He didn't come in and make me become a believer at all. He left me to myself. And that's the way the world is going. Isn't it interesting that Jesus talks about this? He says, the world now is just like the world was in the days of Noah. Buying and selling and marrying and giving in marriage and raising children and raising crops and going along like nothing is going to change. And then the waters came. And that's exactly where we are today. Jesus, where is He? 2,000 years have gone by. We're still waiting. Give it up. I've been told that 100 times in the last month. Give it up. He's not coming back. You don't have to worry about that. Everything's just going to go on. This judgment you're talking about is just a fiction. Don't worry about it. I'm not worried about it. Nothing at all to be worried about. But you know, isn't it interesting? The older I get, and I'm sure that everybody in this room would say this, isn't it interesting how as we grow older, how much faster time seems to go by? Yeah. I mean, I can't believe it. Terry and I worked on an album, and that album now is 10 years old. I can't fathom in my mind. That seems like yesterday we were working on that. It seems like yesterday. I got a picture on our dresser, Becky has it there, of Jackson at about 3 years old. And we're piled up against the pillows on the bed. He's smiling and I'm smiling. And I'm looking at that picture. Jackson's 21.
Yeah.
That picture looks to me like a memory of yesterday, but Jackson's 21 years old. He's a grown man. Paul says this to the church at Corinth in 2 Corinthians chapter 5. He says, since then we know what it is to fear the Lord. Now think about what that means. You and I know what it is to fear the Lord. We know that. We try to persuade people, he says. What we are is plain to God. And he says, I hope it's also plain to your conscience. We, apart from God's reconciliation, apart from God's mercy to you and me, we're on the other side of judgment. The only thing that separates us from what Jesus says about these tenants, who he says the owner of the field will come back and destroy the tenants. The only thing that separates us from that is we've asked for mercy. That's all. I think it's so obvious when we say we know what it is to fear the Lord that statement should show itself in some ways in our lives. And I think it does. I mean, I know most of you in this room pretty well. And I would say in every life, I can point to things in your life where I see that the fear of God makes a difference in who you are. And when I say fear, please don't misunderstand me. It's not like we're running away from the pagan gods who are going to torch our village if we don't throw the right amount of fruit into the volcano. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about we have a healthy respect for God as God. Well, what our lives say about us, though, sometimes paints a very different picture. Since we know what it is to fear the Lord, but do we really? That's a hard question, isn't it? I mean, think about it. I heard somebody say this, and I think there's something to this. They said, if you want to know what's important to anybody, take a look at two aspects of their life, their checkbook and their day timer. And then you'll know exactly what's important to that person. And I think there's something to that. And when I say day timer, I mean, I guess I don't even have one. I don't know if you do. But what our days look like. What is a day structured like in your life and in mine? And that says what's important. It's interesting, we live at a time in which, and nobody likes to think about this. How do I know that? Well, I read enough articles about famous people, and I see famous people get married. And I've never seen a famous person say this yet. Now maybe they have, maybe you know of one. I don't. Famous, wealthy persons say marriage is a lot of work. I've never seen that. All I ever see is all the happy stuff, right? But marriage is there to teach us something. It's there to teach us. Children are there to teach us. I remember a friend of mine, they had 5 children. They just had another one, and he was sitting on a porch playing his harmonica one day, and I came up to him, I said, "What are you doing, Bill?" You don't know Bill, so it doesn't matter. He said, "Oh, I was just thinking about the fact of how full my quiver is." You know, that biblical picture of a quiver full of arrows as children. And he said, "But you know," he said, "I really am convinced that children are just here to teach me to be patient." I think that's right. And I think marriage is the same thing. I think lots of things in our lives that we introduce ourselves into are there to grow us as people, to make us who God would want us to be. Think now for a moment. Your marriage partner, your friend, your children, they are prophets to you and me. Becky is a prophet to me. I'm a prophet to her. Marshall's a prophet to Becky, and likewise back to Marshall. And your children are prophets. How do I know that? They're forcing me to think about things in terms of what things are really important and what are not. Stop and consider. We talked about it in Sunday school. God, and think about your marriage partner for just a minute. That's not hard to do. Who knows you on this earth better? Who knows everything about you better than your marriage partner? Or if you've got a really, really close friend. There's somebody in everybody's life who they allow to know them. Who knows you better than that person? Nobody on the earth. But then think about how God knows us, right? I mean, the times when I think I'm getting away with it in my mind, God sees all of that. The letter to the Hebrews says, "No creature is hidden from God, but everything is naked and exposed to the eyes of Him to whom we must render an account." The tenants didn't think like that. They thought, he's gone, he's not coming back. He's not paying any attention, we can do whatever we want. When you think about God as the owner of the vineyard, the owner of the earth, the owner of your life and my life, do you think about the fact that everything is exposed to His sight in your life and mine as a welcome thing? Or is it a frightening thing? I think how we stand before God right here and right now will dictate how that emotion plays out. And we all know where we are. We all know where we are. If I've said anything about anything, that you have a question for me, you want to pray with me, you want to speak with me after the service, I'll stay right here as long as it takes as we close. Thank you for